Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Before we get started, let me share a quote with you. The great Les Brown once said, "You can't see the picture when you're in the frame." If you felt stuck in your fitness, mindset, or life as a whole, head down to the link in the show notes and reach out to learn more about Project Endure Coaching so that we can help you step outside of the frame and bridge the gap between who you are now and who you want to be. We can't wait to hear from you. Now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Project Endure podcast, episode 49. We have myself, Joe Rinaldi, and we have a very special guest today down in Atlanta, Georgia, Jake Kauffman. Jake, what's going on, man?
Joe, thanks so much for having me, my man. Glad to be here.
Of course. Yeah, of course. I've been looking forward to this. We connected through social media, and you have an incredible story. And a lot of your story that I'm super interested in happened recently.
Yeah.
But why don't we start big picture overview? Who is Jake Kauffman? Tell us what you want.
I appreciate that. So like you mentioned, my name's Jake Kauffman. I'm an executive men's coach and business mentor for men who are conscious, purpose-driven entrepreneurs who are seeking to accomplish a big mission and have an incredible impact in the lives of others.
I love that, man. That's a concise elevator pitch. That's really solid.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that's the like the resume title, but
yeah, take us back to who is Jake Kauffman outside of what he does for work.
Well, who is Jake Kauffman outside of work? Well, I'm a brother. I am obviously a son. I'm a partner. I'm a bonus dad to two beautiful little kids who are 6 and 8. I'm a deconstructionist. I love personal development. And when people ask me what I do, people that know me, the way that I respond is that I help men die before they die.
All right. Well, you got to tell us more about that. Deconstruct that for us.
Great question. So the process of deconstruction is there are really 3 phases in life: construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. When you think about any traditional spiritual or personal development journey. And I think you'll really resonate with this because obviously we're both men of faith, but in the first half of life, it's all about constructing an identity that ultimately answers the questions of who do I need to be, what do I need to believe, and how do I need to be perceived in order to be loved, accepted, admired, and successful. Right? But this is just a persona. It's not actually who we really are deep down. It's a part of our personality that we've taken on unconsciously, typically as a really, really young child, that represents what many refer to as the admired identity, right? But unfortunately, it's really just a maladaptive coping mechanism to avoid experiencing pain, right? Because what is, of course, the opposite of being loved, accepted, and successful, right? It's of being rejected, not accepted, or a failure, right? So it's ultimately an adaptation or an overcompensation to avoid feeling pain. But what it looks like into adulthood is our greatest skill. So to put it concisely, oftentimes our greatest skill is an adaptation or an overcompensation to avoid feeling pain.
All right. So let me ask you this question because I'm so curious. So someone's greatest skill, let's say in adulthood, might come from that place you just described. Now, if that is someone's greatest skill, or maybe we can use synonymously a strength, and then you're going to go into the deconstruction phase.
Yes.
That's got to be scary for people if they
Mm-hmm.
understand I'm going to now deconstruct this thing that I have maybe built my career off of or
Correct.
my life off of, right? So what does
Yep.
that look like to move into the deconstruction phase?
Uh, great question. This is what's really called the further journey, because, like we mentioned, it's really just a persona. It's not who you authentically are. It's not your true self, right? And when we think about any traditional personal development or spiritual journey, um, it's ultimately a journey about unbecoming, right? Life living up to our full potential. It's not about becoming, although, the coaching industry loves to sell you that, right?
Mm.
Um, like reaching your goals, accomplishing this bigger, broader mission, making as much money as you possibly can, having as big and as wide of an impact as possible, etc. But really, transformation and any type of traditional spiritual journey is way more about deconstruction. This is why in the Bible it talks about dying daily.
Mm.
That's what it's actually referring to. It's not about dying to my desires. It's about dying to who I think I need to be, but not who I authentically am, in an effort to be accepted by other people. And I realize people have a lot of conversations around religion, but I think the Bible provides us with some really beautiful reference points for what this process looks like, because in many ways it's the same across many different religions, and even in like very, very traditional, like the hero's journey, for example, right? It's talking about the same thing. When the hero goes through the cave, ultimately that's the dying process that the hero has to go through, where he leaves who he has become up until that point, to step into and embrace his destiny, which is his authentic identity, right? So that he can go on this further journey and accomplish this higher mission, this divine purpose, which I think God has kind of given to all of us, right? We all have this like divine blueprint, and therefore this divine purpose or mission that we're given to accomplish in this lifetime, that we cannot do based on the resources that we have, the mental, physical, emotional resources that we have up until now. And that's where faith comes into play, right? And that's where a relationship with a higher power, and I'll use the word God, that's where your relationship with God comes into play, because you're forced to go beyond you, right? And you're forced to surrender and operate from a place of faith that doesn't rely, like I mentioned, on your physical abilities, your own private resources. You have to go beyond those. You have to surrender those things. And that's what it looks like to go on this journey. And so what we do with people is we support them through their personal development and their healing. There's no coming to consciousness without pain, as Carl Jung once said. And so what it requires that we do is heal from the past so that we no longer carry it into the present. Because, as mentioned, this identity that we take on very early on is in an effort to avoid pain, when really the hero's journey is all about going into the pain. So many in the coaching space, they try to like circumvent this dying process or lead you around this dying process by focusing on helping you accomplish your goals, right? Which oftentimes looks like, unintentionally, of course, leading people around their problems and around their challenges, right? But any real good coach or guide is going to lead you directly into your challenges and or problems.
The people listening to this podcast who've listened to multiple episodes, I won't tell this story about the buffalo and the cow. I won't tell it in its entirety because people have heard it too many times from me already. But, just that concept of, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. Great book, right? You have to go through. And I love everything that you're saying. And I'm really interested, Jake, as to what that experience was like for you and where you are in that process. So let me ask this first question and we'll see where it takes us. But What is the hardest thing or circumstance that you've ever had to handle in life? So something potentially painful, challenging that you didn't choose for yourself.
Ooh, that's a great question. And I love that you added the that you didn't choose for yourself component. Because Carl Jung, going back to Carl Jung, he actually believes that um, that the necessary suffering that we must go through in order to break free of this admired identity so that we can move into and embrace our true self, our authentic identity, it has to be thrust upon you. It can't be something that's chosen, that you choose willingly or that you go into willingly. There's a couple of experiences that I've had over the past 7 years. I'm kind of coming out of this 7-year cycle, but we'll go with the one that most recently happened that you and I talked about previous to this podcast, which is back in February. I had an early onset seizure. I happened to be on the goal at the time. I was lining up for a shot. My ball was on the grass, but I was standing on the cart path. And so I had this seizure. And of course, I was standing on like 0.001% of the golf course that had concrete and not grass. And I fell backwards due to the seizure, and ended up hitting my head and split my head wide open. I was unconscious for almost an hour, woke up covered in blood, because my head was split wide open. Didn't know who I was, didn't know where I was, didn't know who I was with, didn't know who my girlfriend was. Like it was wild, and suffered a traumatic brain injury. And, I think you and I can relate here where, I've more or less been a career athlete. I was a 3-sport athlete in high school, briefly played sports in college, and have been very, very active when it comes to my physical fitness and health and wellness ever since. And so I've always kind of had this physical ability, right? These private resources or personal resources, as we'll call them, that all of a sudden were no longer there. So physically after the injury, I mean, once the wound on my head healed, physically I was fine. I had all my former strength, relatively speaking, but mentally speaking, emotionally speaking, I no longer had the motivation, the determination, the assertiveness, the self-discipline that I have basically had access to my entire life. Because like I mentioned, I've kind of been this lifetime athlete. Like I started playing sports when I was like 6 or 7, probably similar to you. Mm-hmm. And so, the personality traits or the character traits that complement that drive that I've basically become used to and more or less taken for granted. Now I'm 36. So I've basically had access to these things for like 30 plus years. And all of a sudden, one day they're gone. I no longer had the motivation. I no longer had the assertiveness, the discipline that I've normally had access to. And I started to experience significant amounts of depression, anxiety, grief, irritability, sadness that, threw me for a loop, as you can probably imagine. Because some days it was an accomplishment just to get out of bed. And I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't artificially manufacture that motivation, that self-discipline or inspiration that I've relied upon to get things done, to perform. And this is really the journey that most people must go on when it comes to letting down the high performer persona and putting it down, because it's not who they actually are. It's just who they've become in an effort to be successful. And so for me, it was a death. It was a death of not being able to show up and perform in the way that I was once used to. And basically being completely undone.
Where are you at in the acceptance of just the circumstances, right? Are you at peace with what's happened? Is there a part of you that wishes that you can go back and it didn't happen, or where are you with that?
I definitely don't wish that it didn't happen because, you know, as I mentioned, this is kind of core to the work that I do with my clients and has been for years. And I've arguably been doing this deconstruction work for several years now through therapy and personal development, self-help workshops, private coaching, you name it, all these things that I've invested in to kind of let go of, who I became as a result of the painful experiences that I went through as a child, which we all go through as children, right? We've all experienced some type of trauma in our lives, whether it be acute or emotional, for example. So this was kind of just like the straw that broke the camel's back that ultimately allowed me to embody what I'm constantly coaching my clients through so that they can actually reach their full potential, because you don't achieve your way there, you die your way there. And so for me, this was like the last nail in the coffin, if you will, as far as dying to the identity. But when it first happened, of course, habitually, unconsciously, I was trying to self-manufacture that discipline, that assertiveness, that work ethic that I was very, very used to displaying and obviously utilizing to create success, not just in my business, but obviously when it comes to my physical health and being consistent in going to the gym, showing up for my girlfriend and her kids, and et cetera, et cetera. Eventually I had to get to a point after several months, because the only thing that, and I don't know if you've ever experienced a head injury, but the only thing that you can do is give it time. There's no way to rush the process or circumvent the process. So at a certain point in time, I really just had to surrender to the depression, to the anxiety. And when you think about the dying process, and if you're familiar with the hero's journey, the cave that the hero has to go through, it's defined by suffering, darkness, and grief. And this is what most people want nothing to do with. But it's what's necessary in order for us to live up to our full potential.
I would imagine that there are many people listening to this podcast who either have recently, are currently, or will go through a season of life similar in some ways to what you went through, where life changes, they can't go back and do anything about it. And now they are left feeling maybe down, lost, stuck, frustrated. You said you surrendered to those feelings of depression, of anxiety. What does it actually look like if we were to actually get a little granular for you to surrender to those things that you were feeling? What does that look like?
Tangibly speaking, as you can probably imagine, I had to make very significant changes in my business, not just to accommodate, my recovery, which of course was true, but to basically accommodate this new way of living, being, and ultimately doing, right? Because that's how transformation occurs. If it doesn't ultimately show up in your actions, in your decisions, it's incomplete. And so first and foremost, that looked like making kind of radical changes to my business and how I show up in the business. And so it looked like removing myself from certain responsibilities that I've basically maintained and had for years, whether it was delegating them, outsourcing them, automating them, et cetera. And so made very significant structural changes to the business that basically decreased my overall level of responsibility. But of course, that made me confront fear even more. Like, will things continue to work as well as they have, or will I continue to be as successful as I have once I let go of these things? Right? Once I am no longer the person that's kind of in charge of these certain tasks within the business. Within myself personally, it looked like not pushing myself nearly as hard with my physical fitness, which kind of had become like this, badge of honor almost, where it was like, constantly striving for more. But really in the second half of life, you kind of surrender the need for more and the next level. that is constantly like especially in the coaching space, it's pushed really hard, right? Like more success, more impact, more money, more. But in the second half of life, you really surrender your desire for that, your need for that, because you realize that while that is not inherently bad, any of those things, more money, more impact, or the next level, none of those things are inherently bad. And it's not wrong to desire those things. So let's be very clear about that. But you surrender the need to have that because you come to realize that many people's desire for those things and push to accomplish those things is so that they can personally experience some form of self-validation. Well, what's beneath that? What's the underlying resonance beneath that? It's of invalidation. Mm. That's why they say that every desire beneath every desire is actually lack.
That's deep. That's really deep. Yeah. So, okay. So so you get to this point now where you've surrendered. Okay. Now you have to look forward to everything that's yet to come. Does life change in significant ways when you look, 10, 20, 30 years down the road now? Is life look completely different for you right now than it did, let's say, January of this year?
Totally. Yeah. I've become completely disconnected from things like revenue goals, for example. I've become very disconnected from looking a certain way or being perceived in a certain way. Because in the online coaching space, or, if you're an online entrepreneur, so many people are like, you need to do this, you need to show up in that way, you need to be perceived in this way, look this way in order to like have a successful brand or whatever it may be, which is really all about appearances. It's all about image. It's all about further building up or propping up this identity, the admired identity. Because what we so often find is that while these coaches or influencers, people who are very, they have a high level of notoriety and responsibility and et cetera, they have a reputation. You take a peek behind the curtain at like the impact that they're having with their clients or like what's actually going on in their personal lives. And you're like, oh, it's like their personal life is a mess. They may be successful at business, but they're losing at home, which means that you're still losing at the end of the day. Or their clients aren't getting great results. So while they're making a bunch of money, great for them, their clients aren't experiencing the impact of what they're investing in. And so for me, my focus, this has kind of been the focus of our business ever since it started, was client results first, right? If you have a cash-based business versus a results-based business, I would suggest that your priorities are not, out of order, essentially. There's absolutely no judgment there, because I feel like everyone kind of needs to go through that period of time where they focus on these things that don't really matter at the end of the day, so that they can ultimately embrace what does truly matter, which is impact, which is giving and generosity and legacy. And so for me, it caused me to, I wouldn't say second guess, but reevaluate where in my business we stand to improve in an effort to better client results, increase and improve the client experience, such that people go through our programs and they think to themselves, this changed my life. I wouldn't be where I'm at today without it. And I got more than what I paid for. And so that's what we're really working on right now, is continuing to improve the programs, optimize our current programs, such that happens. And so that we are able to take people on a journey similar to the one that and I say we because, my team is fully on board with this philosophy, not just when it comes to serving our clients, but also integrating this approach into their personal lives when it comes to sort of being of deep impact. And what can we do to ensure the highest degree of deep impact?
That's beautiful. It's inspiring to hear about how this unexpected event that undoubtedly has been very challenging has given you this fresh perspective on life, on business, on impact. And like you probably alluded to earlier, it couldn't have or wouldn't have happened this way without that event. And so, how do you reconcile kind of this thought process of everything happens for a reason? Because I know I've talked to many people on this podcast, and it's a spectrum, right? And I think you and I, because of the faith that we share, probably land in a similar spot. But how do you evaluate this life season from the perspective of faith?
That's a great question. Well, I think there's a season for everything. When you look at nature, for example, there's a planting season, a growing season, a harvest, and a rest season, and you look at the seasons in nature, right? In winter, everything dies, in winter, everything dies. And so when it comes to kind of like embracing this period, like you mentioned, I think it's very easy for us to want to fix it, change it, solve for it, right? And people are tempted, and I was even tempted to find a new and different direction because I didn't want to have to confront the grief, the depression, the anxiety, the potential fear of failure, because obviously I wasn't able to show up in the business in the way that I was used to. And so after several months, the business started to suffer, which was fine. But of course, it pressed in on like this very deep core fear. And so my whole way of dealing with it was really just sitting in the space of that fear and allowing myself to feel it, be consumed by it, not trying to avoid it or circumvent it, but fully surrender to it, as we talked about, allow God to use it in my life, trusting that, just like in nature, there's a winter, but what comes after winter? Spring. And spring is when there is this rebirth that occurs. New life happens. And so for me, it was just kind of weathering the storm and trusting and operating in a space of faith that, this is not a death sentence, right? That God loves me, that God is in control, that he knows my needs, right? And he's prepared to support me in meeting those needs. And so, there was a point where I had to go on medication. So that was kind of part of the resources that I relied upon during that season to support myself, which, as you can probably imagine, I had a lot of reservations about, just because I think, for both of us, our health is a very high priority. So when it comes to synthetic medication, right, I think that's, kind of the last resort that we ever really want to turn to. But just through speaking with my doctors, eventually it was like, hey, this is based on what you're telling us and what you're experiencing, your symptoms. This is, even though it's not a long-term solution, and we know that, and we're going to obviously work through a variety of other modalities and means, holistic, nutritious means to kind of get you back to your health and support you in your recovery. At least at this time, synthetic medication is probably the route to go in order to support you. And so a lot of trust in, God, obviously, but also in my doctors and my team and my company to really take over and support, because I have a very deep rooted core fear around not having my basic needs met. And so what that has looked like for me and how that's manifested in my life and business for myself personally is oftentimes needing to be the person that kind of does everything, right? But once this injury happened, that physically wasn't possible. And so I was kind of forced to let go of a lot of these things that I had relied upon to make myself feel safe, right? Because if I let this go, what's going to happen to me? Is this person going to let me down? Are my needs going to be met? Which was really scary at first, but also really beautiful because, as you can imagine, it allowed me to heal that and ultimately transcend it in a way that now my business is working better than before the injury, you know? And so, yeah, a lot of trust and just continuing to kind of come back to my faith and trust and believe that, you know, in nature, everything has all it needs to thrive. And I am no different because I'm a part of nature.
Yeah. In nature, and I forget where I heard this, but I've tested it just with my experience, but there are really no straight lines in nature. If you look at, trees or rivers or things that are just, natural to this earth, there are no straight lines. And I think our lives are very much the same, where, it's a very winding path that we all take through life, and it looks different for everybody. There's this great Og Mandino quote where he says, "I will love the light, for it shows me the way, yet I will endure the darkness, for it shows me the stars." And I think these hard things in life that happen to us, that we don't have a choice in the matter, they oftentimes reveal these stars, these positive things that we wouldn't have stumbled across any other way. And it's so cool to hear how that's worked in your life. And so, Jake, this thing you didn't get to choose, but without a doubt, there have been hard things in your life that you have chosen. So what's the hardest thing you've ever done on purpose, and why have you done that thing?
It's a great question. Two things come to mind. Like you, I'm a big runner. So in my 20s, no, sorry, yeah, in my 20s, I did two marathons, full marathons, so 26.2 miles. So that was probably physically the hardest thing I've ever done. I did two in 6 months, and so just all the training that was involved, not to mention the literal act of running the marathon itself, was probably the most physically difficult thing I've ever done. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I would say, it's been entrepreneurship. Before ever stepping into coaching, I was in the healthcare technology space and one of the founding members of a healthcare technology startup. And we had no idea. I had no idea how to make it work, like how to actually sell the service that we had provided, the software that we created, that we built, but we figured it out. And I remember this very pivotal moment where I was like, I could walk out of this office right now and I would never see any of my other co-founders or the employees at the company ever again. I had my own computer, it was my personal computer, it wasn't a company computer, because there were no SOPs in place, right? There was no training, there was no support. I had to figure out everything on my own when it came to figuring out how to actually sell it. And I told myself, again, very pivotal moment in my life, I was like, I will figure this out. Right? But it pressed in so much on the self-doubt and personal insecurity that I had been carrying around ever since I was a little kid, because I experienced a lot of bullying and abuse when I was younger. And we go back to talking about how our greatest skill is oftentimes like this overcompensation, right? Most people who, when they first meet me, like, oh, you're so confident, well-spoken, assertive, etc., social. But really, how that came to be was because of the deep level of insecurity and doubt that I experienced as a kid that caused me to kind of overcompensate. And so when it came to building that company, I was forced to confront that because there was zero security. There was no assurance whatsoever, no support whatsoever. And so what was I left with? I was left with the relationship that I had with myself. Hmm. And that's ultimately the foundation of all businesses, right? Because the majority of the people that we work with are entrepreneurs. The relationship that you have with yourself is quite literally the foundation.
Specifically in entrepreneurship and in your experience, has that relationship with yourself been the most challenging piece of entrepreneurship? Or is that just one of many challenging components that are all on equal playing field?
It's a great question. I definitely don't think all challenges are on an equal playing field or play as big of a role as you mentioned. I truly do believe that success in business and entrepreneurship is 80% the psychology of the business owner. Like truly, their mindset, their belief system, the identity that they have, the personal identity that they have, ultimately determines their actions, decisions, behaviors, etc. And so I truly believe that represents 80% of whether or not you're going to be a success in business is your relationship with yourself, your personal psychology, belief system, and identity. Whereas 20% is like the strategy that you use and the structure of the business that allows you to grow and scale. And so for me, the more I invest in my own personal healing, self-development, the better my business does. Right? Because the more I grow personally, the more I evolve individually. And as a result, where does that show up? It shows up in the business because my actions, decisions, and behaviors reflect the growth that I'm experiencing within myself.
Okay, I've got two follow-up questions, but first let
Yeah.
me say that I could not agree more with that.
Awesome.
So my first question is, does that concept of investing into yourself and seeing results in entrepreneurship, does that also apply to other areas of life? So someone who wants to be the best mom that they can be, somebody who wants to be the best coworker, right? So that's the first part. The second part is, when were you able to overcome the resistance to actually invest in yourself? Because as a fellow coach, you know that is often a barrier for people, is being able to actually invest financially into their personal development.
That's a great question. And I love that you've asked it. Well, I think every skill in life, there's a fluency to it, right? Becoming a master at whatever it is, whether it's being a parent, like you mentioned, whether it's running a business, whether it's your physical fitness, there's a massive spectrum, right? When it comes to being fluent in that skill set or in that area of life. And what we see from the most successful people in life is that at a certain point in time, you can only grow to your current level of conscious awareness, right? And your present skill set. And if you really want to take that next step, you have to hire someone that is capable of pointing out your blind spots, right? Because we all have blind spots, right? Our unconscious mind dictates 90 to 95% of our behavior, right? And so at a certain point in time, if you really want to take that next step in your skill set, becoming fluent in whatever it is that you want to improve in, you have to invest in yourself if you wish to become better, right? And can you become better through like buying books and listening to podcasts and things like that? Yes, of course, but that's all knowledge and information. Right. Knowledge and information only takes you so far, because just because you read a book doesn't guarantee that you actually apply that thing. And that's where embodiment comes into play, where the information translates into your character. And so, for example, Tiger Woods, he's always had a swing coach, right? And he's one of the best golfers ever in the history of the sport, but he's always had a coach. Michael Jordan, same thing, always had a coach, right? So in order to really achieve true self-mastery in anything with any skill set, at a certain point in time, you're going to have to invest significantly in hiring someone who has achieved a certain level of mastery and can point out your blind spots, show you what you're missing, where you stand to improve. And so I think that's necessary. Specifically with regard to entrepreneurship, though, they've actually done studies on this. They have literally done studies on what separates successful entrepreneurs from unsuccessful entrepreneurs. And what they found was that successful entrepreneurs had multiple, not one, but multiple point of no return experiences. And they specifically defined a point of no return experience as making a monetary investment in mentorship to further them toward their goals. So not only did they have one, but they've had multiple. And so to answer your question around resistance, the resistance never goes away. You just become more resilient. Like the biggest investments that I have made in myself, I have never been more convicted that it was the right thing to do, right? That the coach that I was looking to work with was aligned in terms of my beliefs, my core values, and was far more experienced than I in terms of creating a successful business and having a deeper impact on people and being in service to other people. I never felt more confident and convicted that this was the right thing to do. At the same time, I never felt more resistance than at the moment of decision. Because that's when an identity shift happens. We have to let go of the person who we have been up until now in order to step into who we have to be. Right? So for example, with one of my first mentors, it was the most significant investment I had ever made, period. I had never paid for a car that expensive. And this is like 6-7 years ago now. So better part of 10 years. When I made that investment, I experienced this identity shift. Whereas before I was Jake Kauffman, who had never spent, 5+ figures on a business mentor, to where now I was Jake Kauffman, who had spent 5+ figures on a business mentor. And I've just continued to do that throughout the course of my journey, where now it's, as we talked about, it's integrated and embodied into my character, where that's just the thing that I do, right? As for some people, it's like going to the gym 3 to 4 times a week is just the thing that I do. It's ingrained into my character. It's part of my identity now, right? Well, investing in myself, whether it be my mental health through therapy, specifically with this injury, whether it is through coaching and business mentorship, whatever it may be, that's just become a part of my lifestyle and my character. It's just a part of what I do and how I live my life. And it's arguably the biggest thing that is contributed to my success.
So in order to make something part of what you do and who you are, you have to do it repeatedly. And to do something over and over again requires endurance, especially when you are moving through resistance over and over again. And so I'm curious for you, Jake, what does the word endurance mean when you hear that?
I think it's kind of, they say the definition of commitment is staying true to what you said you were going to do, and I think endurance brings into play simply never giving up on that thing and doing whatever it takes for as long as it takes in an effort to accomplish that thing. Because when you think about accomplishing any life goal, right? Like, let's just take a very basic example, like going to the gym. We know that if you're consistent, it's not a matter of if you're going to see results. It's just a kind of a matter of when, right? And obviously there are multiple factors that play into that, like genetics, family history, nutrition, things like that. But if you're consistent in going to the gym, eventually we know that it's inevitable you're going to see results. The same is true for accomplishing any life goal. And we'll specifically put this in the lens of entrepreneurship. The only way that you're not going to accomplish what you set out to accomplish in entrepreneurship is if you give up early or you don't spend the necessary amount of time. That's it. That's the only thing that will ultimately prevent you from not accomplishing what you set out to do in business. And so that's what endurance means to me is, yes, the commitment piece, staying true to what you said you were going to do, but doing whatever it takes for as long as it takes to ensure that you reach the goal. And that's when you kind of realize that it was never about the goal to begin with. It was about who you needed to become in an effort to get there, and who you needed to let go of and what you needed to let go of in order to get there.
There's just no saying it better than that. That was perfect. I want to throw in on top of that, in addition, an Albert Einstein quote to just drive this home. Albert Einstein, arguably one of the smartest human beings to ever walk planet Earth, is credited with saying, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer." And it's about persistence. It's about enduring in a specific direction over a long period of time. And I couldn't have said it better than you, Jake. And so with that, let's move to kind of this final piece of the conversation. And there are people listening to this podcast all over the place in different life seasons. Some are in spring, some are in summer, some are in fall, some are in winter. If you're speaking specifically to the people who are maybe in a colder season, a darker season, the winter season of, and they're just not sure what to do, what to think, where to go, what would you say to those people? And I want you to answer this question knowing that in a second you're in someone's ears. Someone is listening in the car, at the gym, doing laundry, and I hope that these words find them exactly where they need them. So, go ahead.
I mean, not to oversimplify things, but you are exactly where you need to be. You are exactly where you need to be, because if you weren't, you would be somewhere different. The law of polarity states that everything in this universe has an opposite. The issue is that most people want success without failure. They want love without rejection, right? Those things go together. So if you attempt to avoid failure, you simultaneously avoid success. There's no way around it. There's absolutely no way around it. And I say that for the people, like you mentioned, who are specifically going through like a dying season or, like a darker season. You must go through this season and glean all of the value and all of the growth possible available to you here in this moment if you wish to experience the success or the joy and fulfillment, the elation, whatever's on the other side of it. You have to. And that's what most people want to avoid, or they resist, right? They resist it because of the uncomfortable emotions that it brings up in them, right? Sadness, frustration, discouragement, etc. Right? But you have to go through that if you want to get to the other side and truly be able to enjoy and appreciate it, because it's the bad times, right? It's the darker seasons that allow us to really fully enjoy the brighter moments in life and seasons in which we're experiencing a harvest because of the contrast, right? What makes life actually so beautiful is that there's an end to it. We're all gonna die. That's what makes life so beautiful. If there was no end, if it wasn't finite, then nothing would really matter, right? There would be there's no inevitable consequence for not setting out to accomplish your dream or fulfill your divine purpose or mission. There is no consequence. Well, we know that there's a consequence because eventually you're going to die and you're no longer going to have that opportunity. That's what makes life so beautiful, is the contrast. So this season that you're in, it's important, it's necessary. Seek to find the beauty in it.
Man, I'm at a loss for words. I think you and I are very much on the same wavelength. And it was just, it was exactly what someone, probably multiple people, needed to hear. And I know that I've needed that message at various points in life. And I'm sure I'll need that message again at another time. And I'll be sure to listen back to this. And so, Jake, any closing thoughts or final words in addition to everything that we spoke about today?
Not really, other than to, continue to invest in your healing, right? Continue to do the work on yourself. So many people are overly focused on investing in their physical health, but not their mental health. I truly believe that specifically with regard to men, because, in our group programs, they're only catered to men. I do believe that, as one of my coaches, his name's Nick Boletto, who works for my team below me, said that men doing their healing work is social justice work. Right? It's how this world is ultimately going to change, and true equality for all will happen right? Such that suffering, war, and income disparity, and we could go on, comes to an end. So continue to do your healing work, continue to invest in yourself, but also be satisfied, be grateful for where you're at. Sometimes surrendering the need for more is what allows you to truly enjoy where you're at.
Yeah. Now, Jake, if today's conversation resonated with someone and they want to connect with you, they want to follow along with your journey, they want to reach out, where's the best place for someone to do that?
Instagram would probably be the best. I'm also on Facebook and active on Facebook, but on Instagram, you can find me. I am Jake Kauffman. On Facebook, it's just Jake Kauffman, big picture of me. You can't miss it. Otherwise, my website is jacobkauffman.com.
Awesome. Well, Jake, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you for sharing your story, because it's important that we be vulnerable and open, and that's exactly what you're all about. And I just appreciate you, man.
Joe, thanks so much. Really appreciate you. Thanks again for having me.
Anytime. If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Indoor podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. And one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Indoor Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.